Before Aileen became one of the most notorious female serial killers in history, her life was shaped by trauma, instability, and decisions that would ultimately have devastating consequences. Welcome to Something with Rum, where we will be exploring the darkest corners of the human mind. Today we are going to be discussing Aileen Wuornos, female serial killer. We're going to be having a look at the events that turned her life into a path of violence and the psychological factors that influenced her crimes. From her difficult childhood to her early experiences with abuse to the adult decisions that ultimately led to murder, this is a story of a woman whose life was marked by darkness long before the world knew her name. Aileen Wuornos was born the 29th of February 1956 into a world that offered little stability and protection. Her father abandoned the family before she was born, and her mother struggled with alcoholism and mental health. From an early age, Aileen experienced neglect, physical abuse, sexual abuse, and a sense of isolation that would shape the way that she viewed the world. Psychologists studying her life noted that these formative experiences, growing up in an environment filled with fear and instability, ultimately had a profound effect on her developing mind. This influenced both emotional responses and her ability to form healthy relationships. As Aileen entered adulthood, the instability of her childhood followed her. She faced homelessness, poverty, and a series of abusive relationships that reinforced those feelings of fear and mistrust. Like many people who experience early trauma, Aileen found it difficult to form secure attachments, and she often found herself in dangerous situations. Psychologists studying her case stated that the prolonged exposure to the abuse and the neglect created patterns of survival behaviour that in extreme cases can contribute to violent responses. Over time, these experiences and pressures coalesced, pushing Aileen towards a series of decisions that would ultimately define her life and crimes. Now, I want to make it clear that while these experiences do not excuse her crimes, they provide context for understanding the psychological factors that influenced her behaviour. In 1986, Aileen met Tyria Moore in a bar in South Daytona in Florida. The two formed a close and intense relationship that would become one of the most significant and influential relationships in Aileen's life. The bond between the two was intense and deeply dependent. It was shaped by fear, emotional attachment, and a shared sense of isolation from the world. Psychologists have noted that for individuals with unresolved trauma, such as Aileen, these relationships, or this bond that she had with Tyria, can create a powerful need for protection and validation. Now, in psychology, this dynamic is often referred to as a folie à deux. Now, this is a psychological term defining a situation whereby two people can share and reinforce some really delusional beliefs and behaviours, often influencing each other in very extreme and sometimes dangerous ways. In Aileen's case, this dynamic further reinforced her survival-driven mindset, contributing to decisions that would soon escalate into violence. Between 1989 and 1990, Aileen Wuornos was linked to the deaths of 7 men in Florida. The first known victim was Richard Malroy, a 51-year-old electronics store owner. He was killed in November of 1989. Wuornos later stated that this was the first time she had acted violently. She claimed that she believed that her life was in danger. In May of 1990, the violence escalated. David Spears, a construction worker, was also killed. This was followed shortly afterward by Charles Humphreys, a former chief of police. In June of 1990, Charles Cascaden, a rodeo worker, was killed. And around the same time, Peter Seams, a sailor, disappeared. Peter's body was never recovered. However, his vehicle and his belongings were later linked to Wuornos, and he is considered to be one of her victims. The killings continued into the summer. Meat salesman Troy Bress was killed. This was followed by the final known victim, Walter Antonio, a truck driver who was killed in November of 1990. In each of these cases, the victims were killed by gunshot wounds inflicted by a handgun. Court reports and investigative findings indicate that each victim was shot multiple times and at close range. The weapon used was later identified as a .22 caliber firearm. While the circumstances for each case slightly vary, the consistency in the method was one of the factors that allowed the investigators to connect the cases and establish a pattern of behaviour. Each victim represented a separate life with stories and families and histories well beyond the crimes that occurred. As investigators reviewed the cases, the similarities in the method and the circumstances led law enforcement to connect the deaths, ultimately identifying Wuornos as a suspect, finally bringing this series of killings to an end. At the centre of Aileen's case is a long-standing debate over motive. Aileen claimed that the killings occurred out of fear and past trauma. However, the investigators and the prosecutors determined there were patterns that suggested control, intent, and an escalation rather than a spontaneous reaction to genuine danger. Psychologists who have examined Aileen's case often reference the severe, long-standing trauma, including abandonment, instability, the continuous victimisation, as factors that have shaped her worldview. Now, chronic trauma can influence how a person perceives threat. This can be real or it can be imagined. This can lead to hypervigilance, emotional dysregulation, and a survival-based mindset, which is what Aileen is believed to have had. In Aileen's case, these psychological factors may have influenced how she interpreted situations and responded to them. At the same time, trauma does not remove accountability. The consistency of the crimes, the same weapon used, and the actions taken after the crimes were committed really complicate the narrative that she was acting in self-defense. Her case sits at the intersection of psychological damage and personal responsibility. It's a reminder that understanding the mind behind the crime is not the same as justifying the crime. Aileen's arrest marked the beginning of a highly publicised trial that quickly drew a lot of media attention. In court, her behaviour was often unpredictable and her statements often shifted over time. This only added to the public's fascination with her. The media coverage often portrayed Aileen as a symbol of pure evil or this tragic figure that was shaped entirely by her past, and it left little room for nuance. Ultimately, Aileen was convicted and sentenced to death, bringing a legal end to the case, but not to the debate surrounding it. From a psychological perspective, her story highlights the long-term effects of untreated trauma, social isolation, and instability, while also reinforcing the reality that Trauma does not absolve responsibility of violence. Aileen's case forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. Understanding the mind behind the crime is essential, but it must exist alongside accountability. It is in this space between empathy and justice that the darkest questions about the human mind remain.